All right, we're starting with chapter 1, Unreal Tales, number 42. Jack Blank, I know you're in there. Mrs. Thedwick's shrill voice pierced the air, hitting Jack's eardrums like a siren. She stood at the library door holding her yardstick. Mrs. Thedwick was a tall, spindly old lady with horn-rimmed glasses and a wound-up knot of frizzy gray hair. As usual, her face was scrunched up like she'd smelled something funny and didn't like it one bit. Jack could not imagine a Mrs. Thedwick existing anywhere in her past, present, or future. Could not imagine a Mr. Thedwick existing in her past, present, or future. Mrs. Thedwick never went anywhere without her trusty yardstick. It was pretty much part of her hand. With it, she was ready to strike out at any and all knuckles and backsides within a 3-foot radius, whether they deserved it or not. Mrs. Thedwick carried a ruler for years before a fellow teacher at St. Barnaby's finally suggested the yardstick. She tried it out once and knew right away there was no going back. The yardstick was her weapon of choice, and she wielded it like a ninja master. Jack ducked farther down behind the bookcase. Mrs. Thedwick was bluffing. No way she knew where he was. No way. Don't make me come in there, Jack, she warned. I want you out of here by the count of 3. Front and center, young man. 1. Jack held his breath as Mrs. Thedwick tapped her yardstick against the open door. She was bluffing, right? 2. Mrs. Thedwick continued. Jack cringed as she stepped through the library door and reached for the lights. 3, she said flatly. Fluorescent light bulbs flickered on, and Mrs. Thedwick started searching the library. She reached out with a yardstick, banging on tables, bookshelves, and countertops. She was like a hunter flushing out her prey. Jack braced himself for the inevitable yardstick thwacking. Jack heard Mrs. Thedwick tap her yardstick on different surfaces. The tapping got closer and closer until Mrs. Thedwick slapped her yardstick down on a bookcase right next to Jack. Jack was certain he was caught, but Mrs. Thedwick let out a frustrated humph and turned out of the library, shutting the lights off behind her. She hadn't seen him. He was safe for now. Whew, Jack said to no one in particular as his entire body unclenched. Jack was hiding because it was the day of a big field trip. Ordinarily, children's Jack's age looked forward to field trips. Jack would have looked forward to them too if he'd been allowed to go. Every time he got on the school bus, however, it broke down, or it went too fast, or the radio would mysteriously switch stations from the news channel to rock stations, hip hop, and baseball games without anybody touching the dial. The teachers didn't know what these strange things were all about, but they knew they only seemed to happen when Jack was around. So whenever there was a class trip, Jack was sentenced to stay home doing chores until the other students got back. Mrs. Thedwick had prepared an endless list of tasks to give Jack, but she had to find him first. All things considered, it wasn't the worst thing in the world to miss a St. Barnaby's field trip. It wasn't like the students ever went to a cool place like a planetarium or museums with dinosaur bones or anything like that. As Jack hid in the library stacks, the other orphans were heading to the Mount Dismore maximum security prison. H. Ross Calhoun, the head disciplinarian at St. Barnaby's, always planned trips like this to scare the children into behaving and show them where they'd end up if they didn't straighten up and fly right. Jack was glad to be missing this one. He was pretty sure that if he did go to the prison, Mrs. Thedwick would have some chores for him to do there, too. She'd volunteer him for everything from scrubbing iron bars on jail cells to helping train the guard dogs by giving them something to chase down and chew on. Mrs. Thedwick was also planning to get a good look at the prison's new electric fence and bring the old one back with her. The electric fence that currently lined the perimeter of St. Barnaby's was practically an antique that shot sparks out when it rained. All the teachers agreed it was time for an upgrade, and even a hand-me-down prison fence was an improvement on the current state of affairs. Jack suspected that if Mrs. Thedwick got him out to Mount Dismore, she'd put him to work carrying sections of the fence out onto the bus in the pouring rain. That is, unless Rex and his buddies managed to stick him in a jail cell first. Either way, it would have been a pretty bad day, so he was quite happy to be right where he was, stowed away at the St. Barnaby's library with a stack of old comic books. A few years back, the comics had been left in the orphanage donation box, along with some old toys and secondhand clothes. Comic books were pretty high on the list of banned items at St. Barnaby's, and they were meant to be thrown out immediately. That's what would have happened if Mrs. Thedwick had taken care of herself, but she hadn't taken care of it herself, but she hadn't. She'd told Jack to do it. Jack remembered the day and how excited he'd been. These comics were like no books or magazines he'd ever seen. They were old issues with fading towards torn pages, but to Jack, they were bright, colorful, and crackling with energy. They had superpowered heroes, laser beam, and explosions. They had action-packed words like quack, kapow, and arg. Jack couldn't bring himself to throw them away. He just couldn't. Instead, he hid them in the stacks on the second floor of the St. Barnaby's library, where hardly anyone ever went. Almost all of the comics were missing covers, and quite a few were missing the pages at the end. That didn't bother Jack. He was a creative kid, perfectly happy to make up whatever ending suited him. Jack figured out his own ways for Captain Courage to defeat Dr. Destructor, or for Laser Girl to escape the warrior woman of Planet 13. He drew them on notebook paper and stapled them into the comics. He came up with all kinds of wild ideas like dimensional doorways, time traps, freeze ray reversers, and more. Jack loved the comic book world. He felt at home there. He could imagine himself standing shoulder to shoulder with the heroes and believed that something spectacular out there, there was something spectacular out there in the world, that amazing things really could happen. Jack would hide out in the library with a stack of comics and a flashlight for hours at a time, completely forgetting the grim lessons of his teachers at St. Barnaby's. Alone in the library, Jack learned new lessons about justice, honor, and courage, about standing up for the little guy and doing what's right. These were the hallmarks of a hero. These comics were Jack's true teachers, and they never told him to grow up or stop dreaming. Once Jack was absolutely sure that Mrs. Thedwick was gone, he took the comics out of their hiding place. What was he going to read today? Jack had already read each comic at least a dozen times or more. It was all a matter of finding the right comic for his mood. He skimmed through the options. Chi, this super sensei ninja master who is taking on the evil Ronin assassins on the pages of Zen Clan Wars. Jack set that one aside. A definite possibility. The medieval adventures of barbarian kings were waiting for Jack in the pages of the mighty Hovarth. Hovarth wasn't really one of Jack's favorites. Eventually, Jack settled on the Unreal Tales number 42 and the escapades of the spacefaring hero called Prime. It was one of the rare comics in Jack's collection that the cover was still intact. The words "Alone Against the Robo-Zombies of Asteroid R" lit up the front page, right over a picture of Prime, hopelessly outnumbered by an army of scrap metal cyborg monsters. Jack settled himself into a comfortable position. He hadn't read this one in a while. Jack was halfway through the comic when he thought he heard someone in the library. He almost got up to take a look around, but he was at his favorite part of the story. Prime was in mortal peril, surrounded by robo-zombies and blasted with a direct hit from a robo-ray gun. The black eye of the robo-zombies started appearing on Prime's face. Every robo-zombie had a dark line running around their right eye, with another line running down across their right cheek. Prime was turning into a robo-zombie himself. Would he be able to fight off the transformation? Would he become an evil robo-zombie bent on world domination? Jack read on as Prime took a robo-zombie prisoner and blasted away from Asteroid R in a stolen starship. Over the next few pages, Prime pressed the zombie for a cure, but to no avail. The robo-zombie just laughed as the timer on his chest counted down. Jack turned the page to see a full picture of Prime's ship exploding in space. Did Prime get out in time? There was no way There was no way to know. The final pages were missing, ripped out long ago. Jack got out his notebook paper and started thinking about how the comic should end. Really, he should have been putting it away because the noise he'd heard. Someone might be out there, maybe even a teacher. But Jack wasn't thinking about that. He wasn't thinking about the fact he'd never actually heard the last school bus pull away from Mount Dismore. He wasn't thinking about the footsteps on the library's second floor inching even closer. He wasn't thinking about any of it until he was face to face with Rex Staples. Found him, Mrs. Thedwick! Rex shouted back in the other direction. Ha! The old bat shouted again. Jack's face fell. Oh, great, he groaned. Whoa, Rex said, looking at the comic books. You're in trouble now, weirdo face. Don't call me that, Jack said, standing up. Who's going to stop me? Rex asked, shoving Jack back down to the ground. Rex stood over Jack and snickered. He had a pudgy face with freckles, spiky hair, and big teeth. He was the same age as Jack, but he was twice the size. At times like this, Jack really wished he had superpowers like the characters in his comic books. Rex picked on him all the time, calling him names, pushing him around, spilling coffee on his drawings. That's right, Rex drank coffee. A 12-year-old who drank coffee. He was a classic bully, but no matter what Rex did, somehow Jack was always the one to wound up in trouble. Good work, Rex, Mrs. Thedwick declared as she made her way through the stacks of books towards the two boys. I knew you were up here, Jack. I just knew. Oh, my goodness. Are those comic books? Yes, ma'am, Jack replied in a sullen voice. What else could he say? He was caught red-handed. The comic books I told you to throw away? Mrs. Thedwick let out a horrified gasp. That was years ago. Jack stood there looking guilty while Rex smiled on. This explains everything, Mrs. Thedwick said, still in shock. Why you won't behave? Why you won't listen? It's these ridiculous magazines poisoning your brain with nonsense, childish nonsense. This is why you're always such a problem. It's why he's always such a weirdo, Rex added. At least I'm not a snitch, Jack told the Rex, who immediately punched him in the shoulder. Ow, Jack yelled. Mrs. Thedwick, are you just going to let him hit me? You deserved that, Mrs. Thedwick scolded. Calling Rex names only when he's only being responsible, she added, shaking her head. Young man, when are you going to grow up? Grow up, Jack said. I'm only 12 years old. Well, when I was your age, I was much older than that, Mrs. Thedwick fired back. Mr. Calhoun is going to hear about this, Jack. You can count on that now, and it's for all these absurd comic books. This time, we are going to throw them out. Rex, before you get back on the bus, I want you to put every one of these childish publications into the incinerator. No, Jack yelled, and the lights in the room suddenly grew brighter before fading back down to their regular levels. What in the world? Mrs. Thedwick wondered aloud. It's Jack, Rex said. He's messing around with the lights. What are you talking about, Jack said. I am not. The lights grew incredibly bright again, then slowly returned back to normal. Mrs. Thedwick went to the window and saw sparks coming off the electric fence. Calm down, Rex. It's just the rain shorting out the fence. It drains the power from the school's generator. This won't happen when we get the new one. I'm telling you, it's him, Mrs. Thedwick. This kind of crazy stuff always happens with him, Rex said. Like when the bus breaking down or that time Jack broke my calculator in the middle of a math test. It was my calculator, Jack replied. You stole it from me and it didn't break. The lights intensified to their brightest setting yet. It's him, Mrs. Thedwick. He's doing it. Make him stop. I'm not doing anything, Jack said, raising his voice for the last time as the light bulb above them surged with power until it blew out with a crash. Oh, said Mrs. Thedwick screamed as broken glass rained down. Jack, that's enough. Whatever it is you're doing, stop it. But I didn't do anything, Mrs. Thedwick. Please don't burn up my comics, Jack pleaded. I'll do whatever you want. I'll do chores all day, all week even. Oh, I know you will, but the comics are getting burned either way. Rex, gather up every last one, then get on the bus. Jack, you have chores to do, but first things first. Mrs. Thedwick took out her yardstick. Jack knew what would come next. When Mrs. Thedwick was through with him, Jack was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to sit down for at least a week. That wasn't the worst part of his punishment either. The worst that there were so many comics that Rex couldn't carry them all, and Jack had to help him take them down to the incinerator. He had to help burn up his own comic collection in the furnace. Watching those books go into the fire was the absolute worst. With the other kids finally off on their class trip, Jack was left alone in the basement, or what was currently the basement, bailing out water to stem the tide of the swamp. When he was younger, there used to be classrooms down there. Now the basement was surrendering to the marshland, slowly sinking a little more each year. Jack hated the creepy slanted basement with its floor tilted on an angle. The basement had nothing more than a long, thin, warped hallway. The high end of the tilt was dry and the low end was wet. Jack thought about how the low end as the deep end because all the way down at that end of the hall was a pool of water around a stairwell leading to the floor below, a floor completely submerged in swamp water. The basement smelled of moisture, mold, and mildew. It was dark, too, since it wasn't safe to use electricity on a floor that was almost halfway below swamp level. The only sunlight that crept through the windows was a combination of dim rays that either climbed above or dove below the swamp water outside. On a gray morning like this, there was almost no light at all, making the whole place look like a ghost school with empty desks scattered around each room, unsolved equations left on the chalkboard, and lonely art projects still taped to the wall. Jack navigated the puddle-ridden basement in squishy shoes. Splish, splash, splish, splash. He held a bucket to carry water from the deep end of the floor up to the shallow end. Back and forth, he made his way across the basement, up the tilted floor to the dry side, where he would climb a rickety wooden staircase that led to a window by the ceiling. Once he got there, he'd dump a bucket of green water outside and go back and do it again. He was supposed to keep going until the floor was dry. Splish, splash, splish, splash. It was no use. Swamp water seeped in everywhere. It was a never-ending job. One way or the other, Jack always ended up doing jobs like this as punishment for something. These days, it was usually punishment for something he did, in fact, do. There was a time when he used to keep his head down and try to follow the rules, but he found out that that didn't work at a place like St. Barnaby's. Not for him, anyway. Even when he did what he was told and played the part of the model student, he always managed to get in trouble with the teachers for some new rule he'd broken or was suspected of breaking. It was no wonder he started sidestepping the rules whenever he could, like hiding from Mrs. Thedwick to dodge chores or stashing the comic books in the library. Sometimes it worked out, and sometimes it didn't. This time, it didn't. While he worked, Jack thought about what was happening with the lights in the library. He had to admit, weird stuff like that did happen a lot, like the calculator incident Rex was talking about. Jack remembered it well. It was the day of a big math test, and Rex had forgotten his calculator, so he stole Jack's. Jack was so mad. And then the calculator fried itself 2 minutes later. The look on Rex's face at the moment was almost worth losing the calculator. But Jack didn't have anything to do with the breaking. How could he have? Ashton, get out of the way. Jack's ponderings were cut short just as he was emptying a pail of water out the window. He heard something behind him. Something way back on the deep side of the floor. A sound, almost like bubbles. A sound like something was coming out of the water. "Hello?" Jack called back from the window. There was no answer. Jack waited a minute, then tried to shake it off. Probably just some air bubbles, he told himself as he started back down the stairs. No big deal. Then he heard the dripping, heavy dripping, like water running off a person's body onto the floor, like a large person stepping out of a bathtub or a swamp. "Hello?" Jack called again, a little bit more scared this time. "Is anyone down there?" The reply were footsteps, watery footsteps, from all the way down on the dark side of the basement. Splish, splash, splish, splash. There was no question about it. Somebody was definitely down there. Jack walked with his pail to the flooded side of the basement. He stood at the doorway of the waterlogged classroom. "Who's down there?" Jack called with all the courage he could muster. Again, he could hear footsteps. Splish, splash, splish, splash. The sound was coming from another room down the hall. Jack's first thought was that Rex and his cronies were messing around with him, but everyone was supposed to be on the field trip. So who was down there? Slowly and carefully, Jack walked after the footsteps, following the sound. He was sure the noise was coming from a classroom down near the deep end of the hall. He followed the noise on another warped doorway and looked inside to find dead quiet in an empty room. He checked a few more rooms and found nothing each time. The footsteps were gone. Jack decided it was his imagination. He filled his bucket with water and started back towards the rickety wooden staircase on the dry side of the floor. A door shut behind him. Jack turned around with a jump and dropped his bucket. An old, creaky door, dragging several inches of water with it, had just closed itself at the end of the hall. This was not his imagination. Most of the classrooms were connected by interior doorways, so Jack had no way of knowing which door had just mysteriously shut. He started down the hallway, looking for a clue. The dim light of the windows flickering ever so slightly off the surface of swirling water at the very end of the hallway. Something was down there. Jack picked up his bucket and started inching towards the corridor into ankle-deep water. The closer he got, the better he could see the water churning about, like someone had just slipped beneath its surface. He reached the stairwell, the very place where the swamp was flooding in from below. A lone banister was all that remained to mark the location of the staircase. It reached out from the murky depths in a futile gesture to escape the swamp. Jack sloshed through the smelly water to the open doorway of the stairwell. It was a doorway to both the staircase below and the depths of the swamp. Jack was scared enough to keep his distance, but curious enough that he had to find out what was down there. If Jack had known what was lurking below the surface, he would have run the other way as fast as his feet would take him. That wouldn't have mattered, he thought. It followed him this far already. It had followed him across the swamp, up through the lower levels of St. Barnaby's, and right up to the basement stairwell where it could feel Jack's presence. It was so close, just on the other side of the water. The time had come. Jack was staring into his own blurry reflection in the water, in the murky water, when the image was dispelled by a grabbing hand reaching to clutch at his wrist. Ah! Jack yelled, backing away so fast that he tripped on his own feet. He hit the ground with a splash. The hand that grabbed him disappeared back at the water's edge. What was that? From the ground, Jack watched, trembling, as the rest of this thing emerged from the deep. It looked like a heap of scrap metal. It smelled of mildew and rust and a random collection of corroded metal plates. But it wasn't random. Not really. Wires, nuts, and bolts were sticking out everywhere, and the rising pile of waste looked like garbage left over from the construction work that was always being done around St. Barnaby's. This garbage was routinely dumped in the swamp, but this garbage was forming routinely dumped in the swamp, but this garbage was forming the shape of something. The shifting mass lurched forward out of the pool water in the stairwell. Jack got a good look, and what he saw was impossible. The mass was dark gray everywhere except for shining red lights in the center of what was apparently becoming a person's chest. A newly formed neck raised a newly formed head, and on that head an eye blinked open. An eye with a black mark running all the way around it, and a dark line running down from its inside corner. The creature was exactly like one of the aliens Jack had read about in his comic books. He was looking at Robo-Zombie. Jack shifted in place, letting out a stuttering burble of shock. Frozen with fear, his mind tried to tell him he was seeing things, that none of this was possible. The Robo-Zombie opened his mouth to speak, and a mechanical noise poured out, screeching through the air like choppy analog ringtones and static. Jack screamed and threw his bucket at the mechanical beast. It was all he could think to do. The robot caught the bucket and crushed it in his left hand. It tossed the bucket away and slowly advanced on Jack. Frantic, Jack scooted himself backwards, still on the ground. The lights in the basement were coming on. Just like before, they were starting out low and gradually growing brighter and brighter. This was impossible, Jack thought. Then again, he was staring at a 7-foot robot that just climbed out of the swamp. So what did impossible really mean? The light intensified. The robo-zombie noticed the lights as they reached the height of their brightness, and sparks shot out of the sockets. The power of the lights was supposed to be off because it wasn't safe. As Jack cleared the pool of water by the stairwell, electrical bolts shot through the water, striking the robot. It cried out in pain. Jack ran. Sprinting down the long hallway to the staircase on the dry side, Jack was scared beyond belief. Behind him, he could see the robot down on one knee, looking up at him. Smoke rose off of its frame. It looked angry. Getting up quickly, it charged at the doorway. Too wide to fit through the door, it broke through the wall on either side. It was coming for Jack, and it was picking up speed. Jack had already wished he had superpowers. He'd go to bed hoping he waked up for the ability to fly, turn into steel, or shoot ice razors from his hands. While flying was Jack's first choice, anything would have been fine as the robo-zombie was coming after him. You don't get picky when you have a monster robot chasing you down a hall. Zach reached the wooden staircase that led up to the window. He scampered up the rickety steps, tipping halfway to the top. He caught himself and turned to see the robot powering up in his run. It left the ground and flew right at him. Jack just barely managed to squeeze himself out through the window at the ceiling and took off running across the marsh. The robot barreled through the window behind him, taking chunks of the wall off as he charged out of the basement. The damaged section of the building's foundation sludged into the swamp, and the robot shot high into the air. The robo-zombie circled around in the sky looking for Jack. There was no real cover to be found in the marsh. It was an endless stretch of tall, colorless grass and weeds surrounding vast pools of cold, still water. The drab landscape was interrupted by a few trees and rocks planted there, with long, half-barren hedgerows winding in between. Don't do that, Zahidi. That gives me a headache. Everywhere, everything was beige and tan. Everything looked dead. With the robot in the air, Zach knew he would, in fact, be easily spotted running through the grass. In fact, any movement at all would surely give away his position. Jack was scared to death, but somehow managed to think straight. He stayed perfectly still and ducked down below the reeds.